if you go to the internet and look up, the 6 leadership traits, or the 10, or the 20, or the 30, you're going to get it, right? They're going to keep upping it up. We wanted to keep it to 6. We really would have loved to replicate this session, but out of time constraints, we can't. So we hope you'll come back to hear the last 3 we'll talk about today, because we're gonna shoot on the first. So we're gonna hit with integrity, dependability, and drive. We'll probably end up mentioning people as well.
Including some people probably in the room.
Right.
Hopefully successes, not failures.
Well, the failures will be us.
Yeah.
So
Why don't you go ahead and start?
So I did write down some notes, and to me, it's interesting about, and they are interconnected to me. Integrity, dependability, and drive. So I'm going to make a statement, and then I want to mention a name. Honesty means being truthful to others. Integrity means being truthful to yourself. And I like that because I think in everything we do, when we're looking at dependable people, when we're looking at people at taking the hill, when we're looking at people of doing things for our companies or past companies, there's a name that I want to bring up, and it's going to bring a smile to someone's face, to some of your face, and other people go, who? Mike Tino. Mike Tino worked with me or for me at UTC and GE, and he passed away about 3 weeks ago. Complications with COVID. Now, some of you may say, Tino, Kirk, what are you talking about? He was crazy. He would come in here. The guys at Select would go, he's crazy. He would come in here and just be like a bull in a china shop. But I got to tell you something. If I told him to be there at 8 o'clock, he'd be there at 8 o'clock. He would take the hill. He was absolutely one of the most dependable people on my team. Did he mess up? Absolutely, all the time. And if he was here, I would say that. How many of you knew Tino? Raise your hand if you knew Mike Tino. Not a whole lot of you. If he was here, I'd say the exact same thing about Mike Tino, right? He'd mess up all the time. But I'll tell you, he would always come to me, and he'd call me his consigliere, okay? I'm not Italian, so I don't know what that means, but I think it's kind of good. Maybe it's kind of bad. But he would come to me and say, Kirk, you're my consigliere. He goes, I messed up again. But we would talk it through, right? We would have this huge discussion on what he could be doing better next time. And I will tell you that he, at one time, and we're going to talk negatively about maybe past places that we've been, but I don't want to say negatively in terms of we're going to bash people up. We're not. But in perspective, right? I worked at Interlogics, who shut their doors. Everyone was angry at them when they did that, including me. I had left before that. I was one of the weird ducks that quit. But I'll never forget Tino in Puerto Rico almost going toe-to-toe with Jurgen at the bar, about ready to duke it out with the president of the company. We had to kind of pull Tino off. That's the passion. That's sometimes what we are missing in terms of dependability and taking the hill. So that's my Tino story.
Let's stay with that example for a second. So I don't know if you guys believe in the introvert-extrovert thing. I happen to believe in it. I think some people are naturally one way more than the other, and there's all kinds of studies that say the best leaders are one or the other. I don't necessarily agree with that. But I will tell you, by human nature, I am an introvert. In a party setting, I'm not the guy who's jumping on the stage and singing a song. I'm not the guy who's out there dancing. I would much prefer a one-on-one quiet conversation, or quite frankly, even standing on a stage and speaking to a group, than I would kind of engaging in a big, boisterous way in a party. So I'm an introvert by nature. However, I learned many years ago that in leading an organization, regardless of whether you're an introvert or extrovert, you better be on. And the analogy that I draw is when the curtain goes up, you have a role to play as a leader in the organization, and the role to play is to be on. That doesn't mean you do it on the bad days, because we've all certainly had bad days, and I'm going to talk about some of my bad days, but we've all had bad days, but we are watched as leaders way more than we're aware of. And it's taken me a really long time to realize that. And on, as I say, doesn't mean you have to be, yippee skippy all the time, but on means that in the face of adversity, that you exhibit the calm and discipline that is needed for your organization to follow. The flip side to that is I went through an incredibly difficult time with a family health situation when I was president of Select Security. My wife was diagnosed with a brain tumor, didn't know if she was going to make it. Fortunately, tumor was taken out and she's okay. But as a leader, I found it, although I didn't intend it this way, I found that my vulnerability as a leader to our organization so that they saw that I was a man, not just the president of the company, just like they are men or women. I found that to be not only for me as a leader, but me as a human being, one of the most impactful things that I've had happen to me in my career. And oh, by the way, it wasn't just people within our organization that reached out to me because I was vulnerable. It was people in this room that I would see 3 or 4 times a year at industry events. And I think our organizations want us to be, quote, show integrity and dependability and drive and enthusiasm, but they also want to know that we're humans. And admitting failures in front of our organizations, I think, connects us with them in ways that we're not going to get connected if all we do is think that we're perfect. So, and I gave that example. I've got some other examples of that. Some of you in the room probably have examples like that too. I saw some heads nodding about kind of that balance between vulnerability and being on stage when the curtain goes up. So the bottom line on all of that is be real. Be who you are. Don't try and be something you're not, because that comes across as being disingenuous.
June 21st, 1988. Some of you have heard the story. Let me tell you this before. Many of you have never heard this. June 21st, 1988, I had an alarm company with patrol response and monitoring out in a little area called Pacific Palisades, California. It's a very affluent community out in the suburbs of Los Angeles. The company name was MacGuard Security Systems, so I call it MacGuard 1, I'm now MacGuard 2, 35 years later. One of my employees who was working kidnapped a gal, attempted to rape her, and killed her. In a patrol car, put her in the patrol car, took her to her location, unlocked the building that we were paid to secure, attempted to rape her and killed her. My company was featured on 60 Minutes. It was on 2020. It was 138 newspaper articles written about the company, and I was not morbid to track this to be egotistical. I tracked it to get a change of venue, trying to get out of Santa Monica Superior Court because it was a very liberal court and was trying to get it up to Ventura County, which I was unsuccessful. I was sued for negligent hiring, retention, supervision, 2 other things that the spoliation of evidence, but the judge tossed that out. I had 72 employees. If you take that 72 times 3 people, because of their families, close to 200 people. My company eventually sold. I shut the company down. It was the most horrific experience in my life. Went through a divorce. It was a very trying time. Leadership is tested during those times. Leadership is not tested when things are going great. You need to have a support system of people you can go to, and that's kind of what we've been talking about, right? Having a support system of friends, fellow consultants. You know, it's 33 years ago, and I still get emotional of that. Because someone lost their life. This girl lost her life because my employee killed her. And it was horrific. Bart knew me then. George DeMarco certainly knew me then. I didn't know Merlin then. Who else did I know?
Stan, probably.
Yeah, Stan. And you remember that. I mean, I sold my company, took 3 years off, went through a divorce, went through from very trying times. Mike knew me then, went through from very trying times. And now I don't have any employees. Now, I tell you that story, I don't tell you that story to emote any specific reaction. I'm telling you that because you always need to be prepared, right? The problem that I did is I managed the problem. I didn't lead the company. I didn't lead because I wasn't prepared for that. We talk about generator backups for our central station, all these things, okay, and Mike knows that better than, Mark knows that better than anybody else, right? This happens and that happens, right? But we don't plan for those events that occur. What does that have to do with leadership and 6 traits of leadership? I failed my team. I should have led the company. I didn't. I managed the problem.
Yeah, and I think, and then I want to toss it your way and see what you guys think. But I think kind of intermingled in all this that we're saying here is, at least my view of a leader of an organization. And most of the people in this room are either senior operators or you're the owners of the business. And I don't know what your philosophies are on being transparent with your workforce relative to how the business is doing. But my personal belief is, even though we're all privately owned, I think everybody in the room is probably running a privately owned business or, some derivative of that. Even though we're privately owned businesses and we're not required, as public companies do, in providing performance statistics to our shareholders and our employees, I think as owners, the more we share with our employees, the more loyalty we're going to get. And sharing means sharing the bad too. I mean, I came out of a situation that ended officially on Christmas Eve of last year. And I've never been prouder of an organization than the one that I was running. But it's no secret that the company that I was running went through financial banking relationships pretty frequently for a variety of reasons. In my 9 years there, we had 3 banking relationships. And some of those changes were good changes, and some of those changes weren't so good. But even in the face of difficult times, I felt it appropriate, and there's some former colleagues of mine in the room, even in the face of some difficult situations, I really felt it was important to tell our employees what was happening and explain what a new bank means, what having a new bank means. Explain why we can't organically grow the business maybe the way we would like it, because we were primarily an acquisition company. And I think good leaders have a high degree of transparency to their workforce, because if you're not sharing, they're guessing. And if they're guessing, they're probably coming to some wrong conclusions. So why leave it up to them to guess? Tell them. Again, there's no requirements. No, we didn't have to tell people we changed banks. We didn't have to tell people we couldn't order parts for a while because we were between banks. But we did. Bob, did we not tell people that? So one of the takeaways here in this section is, boy, I would encourage a high amount of transparency to your workforce. Again, it's not for everybody. Some people feel they need to keep it close to the vest for whatever reason, but I don't think that's the best approach. So, any thoughts on anything we've mentioned so far? Go ahead.
Best thing I ever did
Danny.
was let everybody be involved in what our profits were, what the sales board was, who was doing good, who was doing bad. As soon as everybody got involved, we changed the whole culture. It was amazing.
Yeah, y'all hear that in the back of the room? And I think, clearly, and I don't know what you all think about publishing sales performance and stack ranking salespeople and letting the organization know how you're doing. But in my view, if you've chosen to be in sales, you better darn well be competitive. And if you're not competitive enough to be able to say, I'm in 3rd place or I'm in 16th place, I think you got the wrong guy. And we're going to talk about some of those details a little bit later. But yeah, I fully agree with you. I publish as much as you can publish. Mark? And by the way, speak as loud as you can, because we're recording this, so speak as loud as you can.
So I don't get paid for this, but there's a great company in Springfield, Missouri, and a gentleman by the name of Jack Stack, I think he writes a column in Inc. magazine, has a book called The Great Game of Business. It's all about open book management, and they actually have a great group of companies that they work with that kind of takes you through that whole process, and it really transformed our business to be transparent publishing, and I would encourage anybody to take a look at it. The Great Game of Business by Jack Stack.
Thanks, Mark. I know
Thanks.
all of us, when you started out by saying, there's this great company in Springfield, Missouri, none of us thought you were going to go where you went.
And there's also nothing wrong with taking that force rank and going to a friend 5 states away, so there's no competitive nature, right?
Yeah.
And sharing that information with one another. I'll never forget when I was running Post Alarm, Bill Post had a 34-foot motorhome that I think he used once. So I went and repossessed it, right? So I'm taking the motorhome, Bill. We were out in Arcadia near Pasadena, California. We put all of our senior team in the motorhome, and we drove to Phoenix, Arizona, and we went to Safeguard security system. And we did an exchange, a management exchange. And I took his managers, and we ran each other's company for a week. It was fantastic. It was a great
Is that
experience.
like wife swap kind of thing?
That's not
Is that what it says?
So I will tell you, it was fun to do that, and my managers embedded in his organization, and John Jennings' managers embedded in my organization. It was great. It's a great thing to do, especially if it's non-competitive, right? And it's fun. It's like consulting from the inside.
So here's another, and you saying that made me think of this. Here's another area that I think, I don't know about you guys, but I mean, I've had the good pleasure, the largest organization I have ever run was about 8,000 people. So I've had some pretty big organizations in the scheme of things, and now I have an organization of 1. So 1 to 8,000, so I've been all over the board. Someday I should count how many people I think I actually interviewed, and count how many people I hired, and count how many people I fired. Because fortunately, the last number is not real high. It's certainly not as high as how many people I hired. But I've made some bad hiring decisions, and for very senior level positions. And over the years, I have gotten faster at making the tough decision as a leader to admit I made a mistake than I did earlier in my career. Because earlier in my career, it was, no, I can work with it. I'll knowing all along, probably within the first week I hired somebody, I went, dang, great interview. I have a saying when I do some consulting work, that the best day in an employee's tenure with a company is the day they're interviewed. Because that's when they ought to have all of their, their tie tied straight and, their shoes shined. And from there, reality hits, and then, it's downhill from there. Now, not literally, but you get my point. So in my past, I hired a very, very experienced, well-known, credentialed vice president of sales when I needed a vice president of sales. And the interview was great. I knew him. I didn't know him really well, but I knew him. And I swear to you, on day 1, I knew I made a bad decision. The unfortunate thing was, at the beginning of week 2, he was to run our national sales meeting. And I let him run it. And and by the way, our national sales meeting at my last stop was a big deal. I mean, it was like a production. It was really good. And I let him run it, and and I knew it wasn't going to work. And I should have pulled the trigger right away. Well, that's the bad news. The good news is within about 3 weeks after the sales meeting, we agreed that it wasn't the right fit. But my point there is, as leaders, we got to be ready to make the decision and follow our instincts when we know something.
I have a question on that.
Yeah.
Yes.
How did you know?
Without naming names, no, I'm going to answer your question. Your question's a good one, and the question's really clear. So when you see someone actually doing their job, I think a good leader knows whether that person is going to be able to affect the changes that need to be affected to do the job and deliver on the results that need to be delivered on. I think we know that. I think if you've done it as long as many of us has done it, you know it. And there was, in addition to the performance thing, there was a cultural disconnect. The style was just so dramatically different than where we were culturally as an organization. So it wasn't like there was some metric I looked at, because there wasn't even enough time to have metrics. I saw him in action, and it was a great guy, but it was a whole lot of theory and, this is what the textbook says, and it wasn't real. So that's the best way I can answer it.
And let me say one last thing about integrity, dependability, and drive, and then let's move on. So during that time that Steve's talking about, Stephen shared some information with me about this, right? Well, I had lost I was at Alarm.com for 4 years, and they eliminated my role. It's a nice way to say I got fired. But Alarm.com never says they fired me, they eliminated my role. And Alarm.com was wonderful to me. Wonderful to me. And I love them today, as I did then. So I said, now what am I going to do next in my life, right? I'm 60, I just turned 67 this week. So it was about 4 years ago. I go, what am I going to do? So Steve and I started talking, right? Came back, talked to Bob, went through kind of an interview process, long iteration. And no, I was not that sales guy, manager who got rid of it. It was not me. So what happened is I was kind of asking for quite a bit, but not in comp and some other stuff, right? We were talking. And I'll never forget the phone call he made to me. And he said, I have not been able to sleep for the last 3 nights. And he goes, I'm not going to offer you that role. And I said, I think I know why. And I knew why. And he knew why. And luckily it wasn't me, right? I mean, it was the condition of the company and where the company was headed. And I had heard substantiated rumors of what was going on. And I will tell you, to this day, it was a very difficult call for him to make, and it was the best call he could have made. So not only did he treat his team and his staff that way, but he treated potential employees that way. It would have been a huge disaster. I would have relocated from the riot capital of the world, Portland, Oregon, to the Amish country. May have not been so bad, but I would have gone there, and the company eventually, we know what happened. The company is no longer with us, right? So high level of integrity, respect for this man because of that, and it was the right thing to do.
That was a hard call to make, and you probably had some of those hard calls because Kirk was the right addition to our team. But my sleeplessness was I couldn't, and he's a friend. He's become an even better friend, but I couldn't do that. Couldn't do that to him. I couldn't bring him into an environment that was, at that point, not stable, not as in unstable financially, it just wasn't stable. The future was uncertain, and I just couldn't do it to him. So thanks for telling the story. I appreciate that a lot.
Well, let's move on to self-confidence, which is our number 2. See, we're not making good headway here.
I need that.
Jamie says good, he needs self-confidence. Some of the things, a noticeable bearing of presence who can influence other, and the person needs to have strong beliefs and decisive traits associated with self-confidence. Let me tell you something that was really interesting when I went to GE. And I happened to be in a leadership development course at GE, which they call Crotonville. If you've ever been to Croton, it's a big deal to go to Crotonville. and they call it the White House, it's the bar. And I'm at the White House at night. It's a compound. It's a complete compound with a hotel, a gym, a restaurant. You never leave the compound. It's absolutely beautiful. And I'm at the bar, and there's a bunch of GE officers up there, and they're introducing themselves. I'm the CIO, I'm the COO, and after like the 10th of listening to this, I said, well, and they didn't know who I was, but I'm 50 years old when I come to GE, right? So they go, oh, this guy is not a spring chicken. Who is he? So I said, I'm Kirk McDowell. I'm the EIEIO. True story. And one of the corporate officers says, I like you. Come on, let me buy you a cocktail. So we go to the bar. We have a cocktail. And he says, to get ahead at GE, you need two things. You need to be cross-functional team leader. You need to be able to manage and lead across functions, meaning sales, in our company, sales, marketing, central station, legal, HR, you name it. And you need to be or have an advocate. If you don't have an advocate, you are not going to succeed. And I remember, a lot of you remember Greg Burge, who was the president at GE Security. When he was leaving the company, I said, Greg, I'm going to miss you, because I actually thought he was a good leader and I really liked working for him. And he was a GE corporate officer. And he pulled me aside and he goes, Kirk, it's time for me to leave. He goes, I no longer have an advocate. And I thought that was pretty interesting. So we talk about self-confidence. You can have all the self-confidence in the world, but you need to have an advocate, and you as a leader need to be an advocate for your people. Every single time. That taught me that you take the bullet for your people every single time. The only person that's thrown under the bus is us. You can have that discussion later when you're angry and you're mad. But you take the bullet every time. So that's my self-confidence.
So this is my weakest. And some of you probably find that hard to believe, but this is my weakest, because I'm that guy who every night I go home, and whether it's driving home or my head hits the pillow, I'm laying there going, I don't know if I made the right decisions today. I don't know if tomorrow I'm going to make the right decisions. I have this recurring dream that's been going on for 40 years. I told Kirk this story, recurring dream, that I'm on stage and I'm an actor and I'm doing a soliloquy and I forget my lines, and I'm there standing on stage and I have no idea. And that, I think in large part this room is full of people that are generally confident in doing your job, but I'm also sure that many of you in the room feel like I do. At some point in the development of your businesses, you went, am I really capable of doing this? Or am I really capable of going on stage and giving a talk? Or am I really capable of firing that person? And Danny, do you mind telling your quick story about the guy that you talked about at breakfast? The story about the quick lesson that the guy gave you? Because it's directly relevant to this, about failing. Talk loudly. I almost feel like I don't need to tell you that, but talk loudly.
So I was 15 years old. My dad flew me to Chicago for a conference. Never been on a plane before, come from very modest means, but my dad's doing a big speech and beginning to do a big talk, and he puts me in front of a motivational speaker named Rich George, and he tells me, Danny, you're going to be able to go backstage afterwards, and you're going to be able to meet Mr. George. You're going to be able to ask him one question, and people are paying thousands and thousands of dollars to be able to go back and have time with him. So whatever that one question is, make sure it's important. So I'm 15 years old, I've written down all these things. I play basketball, I've got all these things going through my mind, and I get back and I finally look at him and he said, so you're Mr. Tollison? I said, yeah. He said, well, looks like you're getting a free question today. I said, yes, sir. He said, well, what's your one question, Danny? I said, well, that's one way in life I'll always be a winner. I don't like to lose. And he just looked at me and said, that's very profound, but it's the simplest question and the best one I've heard all day. He said, just never quit. So, just never quit.
Never quit.
Yeah.
That's great.
How many of you have a company with less than 50 employees? Look around the room. How many have more than 100 employees? So there's a couple. So, in case you didn't hear that, Mr. Lack of Self-Confidence, John Loud, said, make sure they're all vaccinated, if you didn't hear it. So I do, one of the consulting things that I do is giving guidance to companies that based on the life cycle stage of their business, what should be done, because every company has a natural life cycle stage and there's things that you should do. And generally speaking, when you get around 100 employees, so it might be 75, it might be 120, but generally around 100 employees, the organization needs to change from most decisions being made by the owner, operator, president, CEO, to virtually no decisions being made by the owner, operator, CEO. That is a very difficult transition for you and your workforce, because you can't make every decision because, oh, by the way, they know more about what they're doing than you know what they're doing. And that's a hard one to understand. So when I joined Select Security, I knew at some point I was going to have to transform the organization from owner-operator, making most of the decisions in the organization, to changing the culture as to how decisions are made and the direction of the organization is going. And that was, it was a year process. Because imagine you say to somebody, no, I'm not making that decision anymore. Not only do you have the authority to do it, but you have the responsibility to do it. That's a hard one, but you're exuding self-confidence in giving them the authority and the responsibility to make decisions will help you get out of that awkward stage of it's not quite a mature adult, it's still an adolescent in the life cycle of a company. That's a really big self-confidence show on your part to your employees. Yes, sir?
I have a question on that. Can you do that earlier in the life cycle? And the reason I ask is I'm only 15 employees, but my background came from Southwest Airlines, where it was always next man up, next man up, next man up, who's your replacement? Yep. So I've already got a manager of locks and a manager of security where they have their own autonomy, and then they're already instilling that in the lieutenants below them. So can you do that early? Is that typical to instill that earlier?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question, because I don't want you to think that you shouldn't be doing it all the way along that journey. You should. Where it becomes more difficult is when you begin to have more layers of people in the organization just based on the size.
Yeah, it's much better to do it early than later, because then you have a lot of attitudes to change within the organization rather than doing it early and ingrain that. It also allows you to attract new talent to the organization, because then those people are hiring and they get to see that there's a chance for them to move up in a leadership role.
Yeah, I think I know what you're talking about, because everybody tries to circumvent the new leader that you put there, and they're all going around. And then I'm trying to make a decision going the opposite direction, and I'm circumventing them, and then that starts that turbulence. So, but we've already gotten past that. So I was just curious about that. Thank you.
Yeah, and as leaders, it's hard to say, no. Remember, that's your decision, or that's this person's decision. It's hard because look, whose name is on the door? It's not their name on the door, it's your name on the door. But you will be way more successful if you do. And by the way, that is what we're talking about here. You should be doing it all the time. Because if you're not, the saying, see if I can get this right. The CFO says to the CEO, what happens if we invest a lot of money and train all of our people when they leave? That's the CFO saying it to the CEO. What happens if we invest a lot of money and train our people when they leave? And the CEO looks at the CFO and says, what happens if we don't train all of our people when they stay?
And I love your approach, and you should do that, and then you need to hold those people accountable so they don't come to you and say, that manager, and hold them accountable. I had a chance 3-4 years ago when Tim Wall was the president of ADT to interview him on stage in a setting like this. And it was Tim, I think it was Pam Petro, and I think it was somebody else. And I had known Tim for some time, And we had kind of a history together for some time. I never worked for him, but I knew he was really tough on his direct reports. And I asked him, I said, hey, Tim, I said, I understand that you're really tough on your direct reports. And he starts to grin a little bit, right? Because he's trying to figure out what to say. And out of the back of the room, his CMO by the name of Jamie Henge. Jamie says, can I answer that question? And there were probably 150 people in the room, and he just looks, and she says, and I know this is taped, but this is exactly, she goes, he is a son of a bitch to work for. And she goes, he is toughest on the people that are closest to him. And I remember this because he had supported his number 2 person during some very serious illnesses or illness, and supported. And I had a newfound respect, not only for Tim that day, but for Jamie, who could say this in front of the crowd, right? And Tim laughed and the audience laughed. But it's true, we need to be tough, the toughest on the people that are closest to us in our team, because they are a part of us. Remember my story before of MacGuard 1? I went underground. I couldn't communicate because of lawsuits. I mean, the lawsuits were coming from everywhere. So that, and that was very, very difficult. If that happened again, I'd say to hell with the lawsuit. I would go public. And I would say, okay, guys, here's what we're going to do to change. Here's what we're going to do. And I would have made those decisions. I was tough on people around me, but I wouldn't communicate to them during that time. I learned my lesson. And that's the thing about leadership, right? We make mistakes, we fall down, we dust ourselves up, and we move ahead with confidence. Jamie.
So we were talking kind of in that 50 round. I mean, congratulations to anybody that does it earlier than that, because I know I screwed that up. Really letting go and losing control. But with that, there's really an identity crisis that goes on. Like, am I going to have a job tomorrow? What is my relevance? What do I do in the company?
You mean the leader gets an identity crisis?
Yeah. How does one navigate through that as they're giving up control? And a lot of us are entrepreneurial. And entrepreneurial, boy, I tell you what, we make a lot of messes in our business. And how do we move through? I think you call them SEAL, right? So how do we move through that as leaders? How do we take that next step in our leadership development cycle?
Want me to take a run at that first? It's a good question.
Yeah, it's a great, you go first.
All right.
Dear.
There's a cliche about working in the business versus working on the business, and it's true. It's a cliche, but what does that really mean? So I think you are a certain size in your business, and you got to wear a lot of hats. Maybe you need to run service calls sometimes, and maybe you got to wear a lot of hats. It's just the nature of early stage businesses. As the business begins to mature, and you begin to put people who are expert, supposedly, if you follow the guidelines from the main stage session today, you follow all of those guidelines, and you get the right people. You begin to get people that they do what they do every day. You don't do what they do every day because you wear lots of hats. So they do what they do, so let them do it. So what does that mean to your role? What it means to your role is you should be able to focus time and energy on thinking about, where am I going with the business? Am I going to expand the business? Am I going to organically grow the business? Am I going to look at acquisitions? Am I going to take on new product lines? Am I going to improve margins? Stuff that you can't do if you're wearing all those daily hats. And I don't think and by the way, what I just described is not for everybody, because there are some guys in this industry who do really well up to the stage that we just described at, because they're really good technically.
Yes.
And then they're not so good at the stuff I just described, and quite frankly, that's the time for them to get out. But that's a whole different conversation.
Yeah, Steve hit the nail on the head, but I'll take it one step further. So I do a lot of work with companies in transition from one generation to another. And it's very interesting to listen to these stories, because the son says, or the daughter, I'm ready. And the parents say, they ain't ready. And so there's this difference. It's not dissimilar, Jamie, to what you're talking about. The leader of the organization becomes very comfortable doing those tactical things that they do every day, had been doing every day, the hiring, the firing, the central station, all the things that we do. When the company starts to mature and we don't mature ahead of that company, the company stagnates. A leader should always be looking at the next step up, or they need to look at the next step out. So it comes down to strategy. You should be, my belief is that the CEO should be spending the majority of their time on strategy and letting the key people manage the company. I am working with a company right now where I told the CEO it's time for them to move on. And this is a client of mine. And I told the CEO, it's time for you to move on. We need to replace you. And after 3 or 4 days of going back and forth, he says, you're right. Now, it's not adversarial. He is a wonderful human being, a great leader. He has reached the point in his career that he's reached his pinnacle. He's reached his Peter's principle. He cannot take it to the next level. He can't. It's not disparaging upon him. So I had to tell him that you need to have, one of these is mentorship, next one.
That's the next one.
You need to have mentors. It could be George DeMarco. It could be Steve Firestone. It could be Kirk. It could be Merlin. It could be a friend.
Could be the EMP group.
It could be the EMP group.
ESA.
You bet. That helps mentor. Because we all get to a point where we self-doubt.
Yeah.
Are we doing the right? John Loud does that 6 times a day. We self-doubt. Do we have that wherewithal to move to the next level?
Brad, you had a question or a comment?
Yeah, I was going to say that as you spread out, you can't scale and grow your business if you're in that very stack. So as you spread out and you empower people, one of the things that's worked well for us is having them understand the financial elements of the business. Because if they don't clearly get how all the pieces come together and a simple P&L, then they're great tactical operational people. And it's been my experience, operational people and even a GM role, if they're controlling the gas and the brake at the same time, it's a problem, because when the front end starts to shimmy a little bit, what's the natural tendency? Hit the brakes. Yeah. And I guess in reference to your transparency, when we had gone through a number of job costing software programs and things, and we do a lot of new construction, it was very imperative that everybody knew the cost of what a project manager was an engineer. And so we use a pretty simple burden cost times X, and we just fretted for weeks, if not months, about if we show that in our new bidding estimating program, then everybody is involved in job costing, which should be, as you grow, even the senior technicians to the field PM to the PM, the operations and so on, they're going to know what Brad makes as a PM, or they're going to know what Steve makes. And we're saying, okay, that's a little bit awkward, but most people know what other people make anyways. It's one of these things, don't tell anybody how much money you make, and they all know, and if you're a union, it makes a lot of the guesswork go away. So my comment would be, the transparency is share the costs, because not just the sales reports, but here's what it takes. Because they say, oh, we made X millions of dollars in revenue, people think, they must be rich, you're making all this money. They don't realize that the net op income is not anywhere near that, right? And then how much more do you invest back in? So we found success in driving people to learn the P&L right away. At certain levels, as you scale across either regional offices and once they understood the math, they could then put that filter in front of them and make decisions like, yeah, I really like that guy, but I'm pretty heavy on G&A right now, and my sales numbers are a little low. Maybe I should go get another salesperson. It's almost like a salary cap situation, right? You only get so much money to play with to hit the net op income.
Right.
And then you get to the question, well, we can't afford that. We can't afford not to. So there's always going to be the risk and reward.
Yeah, so that what Brad's describing there is leadership has to be confident enough, that's the topic that we're just coming off of, has to be confident enough to share information and say, look, we're running a business. This is what we need to do as a business.
It's also great for employees to understand that when you're trying to make a decision on bringing in other assets, either people or product or whatever, that they understand that you're making this decision-making process. A week ago, I went to a talk by a PhD on George Washington. He actually runs the Mount Vernon Society. He came to Portland to give a talk on Washington. And one of Washington's greatest strengths was that he would take a long time to make a decision. He would get a lot of input from a lot of people, but once he did, that was the decision, right? And he stayed focused on that. Focus, focus, focus. I think sometimes it's great to get all this input, but it's also really important to let your teams, your staff know, let me tell you the reason we are not doing this, because of this. And they see that strategic view of the company. I think it solidifies relationships with your employees. We are up on our hour, and we've only gotten 2.
Well, let's start this one,
and then let's
because I want to
invite them back.
tease them about this one, because case in point to what we're just talking about here, one of the ways that you build an organization where the owner, operator, CEO, president has to do everything is through, quote, desire to influence and mentor others. And I'll tease this, and we'll pick it up this afternoon. I will tease this, and I didn't ask permission to use this example, but I said in the opening comments that I'd probably talk about some people in this room. I've probably hired thousands of people in my career. There's one example that I can give you that is the best example I can give you of my philosophy is give someone a chance to do something that they never thought they could do or would ever be afforded the opportunity to do. That is on my tombstone. I hope somebody says Firestone did that. Bob Grove, who's sitting in the room here, who's now an executive at Brinks. When I joined Select Security, Bob was the Lancaster branch, so it's a branch level installation manager, and that may not be the exact title, but that gives you the sense for the scope of responsibility. And at that time, Select had 6 or 7 branches. So he was one of 6 or 7. And I met with 100 employees in the first month that I was at Select, and I had a yellow pad, and on the yellow pad I was taking notes, and within 5 minutes of sitting down with Bob Grove, who I had literally just met, when I sat down with him, I wrote, "Why is he underutilized?" And there's lots of reasons why he was. The reasons are immaterial, but I said to myself, this guy has a career trajectory, if given the opportunity, that will make me a proud daddy. And kept giving Bob opportunities, every time we would have a conversation, he would take notes. Introduced him to Leadership Summit, introduced him to ESX, told him one day he needs to speak at Leadership Summit, and I thought he was going to poop his pants. And I know he remembers that day like it was yesterday, to the point where Bob became the vice president of operations and had responsibility for 250 people scattered across 25 branches, and he's now the senior operations person in the commercial space at Brinks. He was the branch installation manager. The point there is, there's people in your organization now and in the future, give them the opportunity to do something they never thought they would have the opportunity to do, and get the heck out of their way.
So let me tell you my Bob Grove story. When I went back and interviewed, I think Bob gave me a thumbs up, is that right? That he's a good guy. Okay, so we are covering 4 more this afternoon, and I will tell you the next one, we're talking about mentoring, to me is the second most important. The first we're going to be covering this afternoon. I'm not going to tell you what that is. We want you to come back. We know there's other speakers, relevant speakers. We want you to come back. Thank you very much. We've enjoyed this a lot. Thanks for your input.